The security guard's hand hovered near my elbow, not touching me, just close enough to make the message clear. Behind me, I could hear Doug Whitfield's office door still swinging on its hinges from where he'd stepped out to watch. He was smiling, not an apologetic smile, not even a smug one, a genuine, relieved smile, like a man who'd just set down something heavy. "Box your things, Claire," he'd said 40 minutes earlier, sliding a manila folder across his desk like it was a lunch menu. "We're restructuring the account management team. Effective immediately." 40 minutes. That's how long it took to erase 11 years. I didn't cry in that elevator. I want you to know that. I stood very straight, holding a cardboard box with a dying peace lily and a photo of my mother, and I watched the floor numbers count down. And I thought about the fact that exactly 72 hours earlier, my husband had packed 2 suitcases and told me he'd found something real with a hygienist named Brooke. Monday, my marriage ended. Tuesday, my career ended. I didn't know yet that by Friday, everything Doug Whitfield believed about his company and about me was going to collapse in a conference room with 12 witnesses. I didn't know that the biggest client his agency had ever signed, a $25 million logistics contract he bragged about at every holiday party, was about to make one phone call that would end his career instead of mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really began. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 34 years old, and until that week, I believed I had built a stable life out of 2 things: a marriage I trusted and a career I'd earned with my own hands. I worked at Halbrook Meridian, a mid-sized logistics and supply chain consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. 11 years there. I started as a junior account coordinator, answering phones, and ended up running client relations for our single largest account, Vantage Rail Freight, a company that moved cargo across 14 states and paid Halbrook Meridian more money than our next 3 clients combined. Doug Whitfield became my boss 2 years earlier, after the previous VP retired. Doug was the kind of man who mistook confidence for competence. He wore his father-in-law's company like a crown. Halbrook Meridian had actually been founded by his wife's family, and Doug had married into leadership rather than earned it. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He compensated by being loud in meetings and cold to anyone who reminded him of that fact. I reminded him of that fact every day because Vantage Rail Freight trusted me more than they trusted him. That should have protected me. It didn't. 3 days before I was fired, my husband Marcus stood in our kitchen in Ballantyne, still in his work clothes, and told me he was leaving. He said, "There's someone else," like he was reading a weather report. "Brooke, from the dental office. I didn't plan for this to happen, Claire, but I can't keep living a lie." I remember staring at the granite countertop we'd picked out together 4 years earlier, at the coffee maker he'd bought me for our anniversary, at the life that had apparently been a performance for longer than I understood. "How long?" I asked. 8 months. 8 months. I had been grading his mother's Christmas gifts, planning our anniversary trip to Charleston, defending him to my sister who never liked him for 8 months, while he built a second life in a dental office 30 minutes from our home. He left that night with 2 suitcases. He didn't take the coffee maker. I remember that detail mattering more than it should have. I went to work the next morning anyway, because what else do you do? I answered emails, I prepped materials for the Vantage Rail Freight quarterly review, I smiled at colleagues who had no idea my life had detonated 48 hours earlier. Doug noticed something, though. Doug always noticed weakness. I think that's the only thing he was actually skilled at. "You seem off, Claire," he said, leaning against my office doorway with a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest boss," a gift from someone who clearly hadn't meant it as a compliment. I told him everything was fine. He smiled like he didn't believe me and filed it away.
By Tuesday morning, he had his opportunity. "We're eliminating redundancy in account management," Doug said, not looking at me, looking at a spreadsheet on his monitor as if it contained the truth instead of the excuse. Absorbed by whom? Trevor's taking the Vantage account. Trevor Ashford was 28 years old and had been at the company for 14 months. He golfed with Doug on weekends. He had never once spoken directly to Vantage's leadership team. "Doug, I built that relationship from nothing. Marcus Wren, the CEO, he doesn't even take unscheduled calls, but he takes mine." It's not personal. It was entirely personal, and we both knew it. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand until Friday, was exactly how personal it was about to become for him. Security walked me out at 2:47 p.m. I remember the time because I looked at my phone once, out of habit, to see if Marcus, my ex-husband Marcus, not to be confused with Vantage's CEO, a coincidence of names that would become almost darkly funny later, had texted anything. He hadn't. Of course, he hadn't. He was busy building sandcastles with Brooke's kids, probably, or whatever new relationship performance he was staging. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. Then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my father. Here is the thing about Doug Whitfield that made his smile in that hallway so catastrophically premature.
He knew I managed the Vantage Rail Freight relationship. He did not know why Vantage Rail Freight's CEO, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Daniel Osei, had personally requested me by name 3 years earlier when Halbrook Meridian nearly lost the account. He did not know that my father, Richard Bennett, had spent 30 years in freight logistics before retiring, and that the two of them had been friends since his supply chain conference in Atlanta a decade before I ever worked at Halbrook Meridian. He did not know that when Halbrook Meridian was in danger of losing Vantage entirely over a shipment delay scandal that predated my promotion, it was my father who quietly advised me on how to rebuild trust with Daniel, contract clause by contract clause, until the relationship was stronger than it had ever been. And Doug Whitfield certainly did not know that 18 months ago, my father had transferred a piece of his logistics consulting firm, the actual holding entity that owned a minority equity stake in Vantage Rail Freight's expansion financing, into a family trust, with me as trustee, not majority owner, not controlling interest, but enough. 14% equity, acquired years earlier when my father helped Daniel Osei's company survive a near bankruptcy during a fuel crisis, structured as a stake instead of a fee, because Vantage didn't have the cash at the time. I had never mentioned it at Halbrook Meridian. Why would I? It felt like a private family matter, disconnected from my day job. I'd signed 100 confidentiality documents over the years, and none of them concerned my father's old business dealings. But I picked up the phone in my car that Tuesday afternoon, hands still shaking, and called my father, not for revenge, not yet, just because I needed to hear a voice that loved me. "They fired me, Dad." "Fired you? For what?" "Restructuring. Doug give the Vantage account to Trevor." There was a long silence on the line. I heard my father exhale slowly, the way he did when he was calculating something. "Claire," said he carefully, "does Daniel know?" "Know what?" "That you're gone." I hadn't thought about it that way. I hadn't thought about anything except the box in my passenger seat and the dying peace lily and my husband's empty side of the closet waiting for me at home. "No," I said. "Why would he?" "Because Vantage's contract with Halbrook Meridian has a key personnel clause, sweetheart. Don't you remember? You wrote it in yourself 3 years ago, after the delay scandal. Daniel insisted on it." I remembered writing that clause. I had forgotten somehow in the chaos of the last 72 hours that it existed. The key personnel clause, section 14.3 of a contract I had drafted myself back when Vantage Rail Freight was one signature away from walking out the door forever.
It stated in plain, unambiguous legal language that Vantage's continued partnership with Halbrook Meridian was contingent upon Claire Bennett remaining the primary account manager. Any change in that role required 30 days written notice and mutual written consent from Vantage's executive leadership. Doug Whitfield had fired me without notice, without consent, without apparently reading his own contract. I didn't call Daniel Osei myself. I want to be honest about that because this isn't a revenge fantasy where I orchestrated Doug's downfall from some throne of righteous fury. I went home Tuesday night, sat on my kitchen floor because the silence in the rest of the house felt too loud, and I cried for the first time in 3 days. Not about the job, but about Marcus, about 8 months of lies, about a coffee maker nobody wanted. My father called Daniel Osei on Wednesday morning, not to weaponize the relationship. He called as a friend, genuinely concerned, to ask if Daniel knew what had happened to me. Daniel didn't know. And Daniel Osei, I would later learn, did not take the news calmly. Vantage Rail Freight was in the middle of a $25 million contract renewal with Halbrook Meridian, the single largest deal in the agency's history, one Doug Whitfield had been publicly celebrating for 2 months, one he'd used in his last performance review to justify a bonus. Doug had gutted the one relationship holding that entire deal together, and he'd done it without reading his own contract. Thursday morning, Doug Whitfield's assistant, a nervous 23-year-old named Priya, received a call from Vantage Rail Freight's general counsel requesting an emergency meeting. Doug, feeling triumphant after 2 flawless days without me, walked into that conference room expecting a routine check-in about quarterly logistics metrics. I know what happened in that room because Priya told me later. She'd been asked to sit in and take notes, and she never forgot the moment Doug's face changed. Daniel Osei did not raise his voice. He never does. That was something I'd learned about him over 3 years of careful relationship building. The angrier he was, the quieter he became. I understand Claire Bennett is no longer managing our account, Daniel said. We've restructured the team, Doug said smoothly. Trevor will be your primary contact moving forward, and I assure you, I'm not questioning Trevor's capability, Daniel said. I'm questioning whether Halbrook Meridian breached its contract with my company, and I'm questioning why the woman who has managed our account flawlessly for 3 years, the same woman who personally saved this partnership during the fuel crisis delay dispute, was terminated the same week her contract clause was clearly still in effect.
Doug's confidence, Priya said, evaporated in real time. She described it exactly like that, evaporated. We'll need copies of the termination paperwork, Daniel continued, and we'll need to understand what corrective action Halbrook Meridian intends to take, because as of this moment, Vantage Rail Freight considers the $25 million renewal on hold pending resolution. Doug's phone, sitting face up on the conference table, buzzed at that exact moment. Priya glanced at it. A text from Marcus Osei. No relation, coincidentally, to my ex-husband, though the name would haunt Doug in his nightmares for months to come. No, I misspeak. It was a text from Daniel's assistant confirming the meeting had been logged and forwarded to legal. Doug asked for a recess. He needed, Priya said, to review some documentation. He spent that recess calling me. I was sitting at my kitchen table Thursday afternoon, updating my resume with hands that still didn't feel entirely like my own, when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see again so soon. Doug Whitfield. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly out of curiosity. Claire? His voice had a strange, forced warmth to it, like a man trying to sound casual while standing on a collapsing bridge. How are you holding up? What do you want, Doug? I wanted to check in, see how you're doing after everything. You fired me 2 days ago. Right, well, about that, I think there might have been some miscommunication on the process side. HR moves fast sometimes, and I want to make sure we handled your transition properly. Have you had a chance to look at other opportunities yet? I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, because I could hear underneath his words the shape of his panic, even if I didn't yet know exactly what had triggered it.
Actually, Doug continued, I was thinking there might be a place for you back on the team, in an advisory capacity. We could discuss compensation, title, whatever makes sense. 2 days ago, you had security walk me out of the building. Claire, that was a restructuring decision made too quickly. I'll own that. I want to make it right. Why now, Doug? Another pause, longer this time. I just think we could use your expertise, he said, which was almost funny because 48 hours ago my expertise had apparently been so worthless it justified escorting me out like a shoplifter. I hung up without answering his question directly, not because I didn't want the job back, I genuinely wasn't sure yet what I wanted, but because I needed to understand what had actually happened inside that company in the 2 days since I'd been gone. My father called that evening. Daniel told me everything, he said. Claire, they're threatening to pull the entire contract. Doug is scrambling. Because of the personnel clause? Because of the personnel clause, and because Daniel specifically told him he wants you reinstated. Not Trevor, you, immediately. Or Vantage walks. I sat with that for a long moment, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Dad, I said slowly, does Doug know about the trust? About my equity stake in Vantage's financing structure? I don't think so, he said. Why? Because I think it's about to matter a great deal. Friday morning, Doug called an emergency meeting with Halbrook Meridian's executive team, the agency's founder, his father-in-law, Walter Halbrook, senior partner Denise Colgrove, and the general counsel, a tightly wound man named Preston Marsh, who I'd worked with on dozens of contracts over the years. I wasn't there for this meeting, but I learned every detail afterward, first from Kriya, and later, much later, from Denise Colgrove herself, who would eventually become one of the most important allies I had in this entire ordeal. Preston Marsh had spent Thursday night combing through every document related to the Vantage account, trying to understand exactly how deep the exposure went. What he found went far beyond a simple personnel clause violation. Buried in Vantage's original financing structure, documentation Halbrook Meridian had access to as part of due diligence work from 3 years earlier, was a disclosure listing minority equity holders in the Vantage Restructuring Trust. One of those holders was listed as R. Bennett Family Trust, trustee C. Bennett. Preston Marsh stared at that line for a long time, Priya told me later, because Preston Marsh was smart enough to understand instantly what it meant, even before Doug did. I didn't just manage the Vantage account. I was on paper a stakeholder in the very financial structure that made Vantage Rail Freight's expansion, and therefore its ongoing $25 million relationship with Halbrook Meridian, possible in the first place. Doug had fired someone with a documented equity interest in his own company's biggest client, violated a contractual personnel clause in the process, and triggered a review that now threatened not just the contract renewal, but potentially Halbrook Meridian's standing with every regulator who cared about conflict of interest disclosures in vendor relationships. Did we know about this? Walter Halbrook reportedly asked, staring across the conference table at Preston. It was disclosed in the original 2023 financing due diligence. It's in the files. Nobody flagged it as relevant because, at the time, Claire wasn't managing the account yet. But the moment Claire took over Vantage Relations 2 years ago, this should have been reviewed for conflict of interest protocols. So it's not illegal, Doug said, a little too quickly, a little too hopeful. It's not illegal, Preston agreed, but it's a nightmare of optics, and combined with the personnel clause breach, it gives Vantage enormous leverage. If this becomes public, if it comes out that Halbrook Meridian fired a woman with an undisclosed equity interest in its own client's financing right after her husband left, and we did it without proper contract review, we will not survive the reputational fallout. Forget the $25 million. We'll lose everything. Walter Halbrook, I'm told, turned to his son-in-law with an expression Doug had never seen on his father-in-law's face before. Fix this, today.
I received a call Friday at 11 a.m. from Denise Colgrove, not Doug. That detail mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened that week, that the company understood, even in crisis, that Doug was no longer someone I would trust to negotiate honestly. Claire, Denise said, I want to be straightforward with you. We made an enormous mistake, and I'd like to meet with you today, in person, to discuss making it right. I agreed to meet at 2 p.m., not at the office. I wasn't ready to walk back through those doors yet, but at a small coffee shop near my house, the kind of neutral, quiet place where difficult conversations happen without an audience. Denise arrived with Preston Marsh. Doug arrived 4 minutes later, visibly having rushed, his tie slightly crooked in a way I'd never seen on a man who normally treated grooming like armor. Claire. Doug sat across from me, hands folded, trying to project calm. I want to start by apologizing. The termination was handled poorly. It was handled illegally, Preston corrected quietly, which I noted Doug did not appreciate. We'd like to offer you reinstatement with a retroactive pay adjustment, a formal apology, and a revised title, Senior Director of Client Relations, with a direct line to executive leadership. We think that reflects your value to the company. My value, I repeated. The value you decided didn't exist on Tuesday. Doug's jaw tightened. Claire, I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, Doug. I'm informed. I know about the personnel clause. I know Daniel called an emergency meeting. I know Preston found the equity disclosure in the financing documents. I watched all 3 of their faces as I said this, and I confirmed everything I needed to know from the flicker of surprise in Doug's eyes. Surprise that I already knew, and something underneath it that looked almost like fear. Then you understand, Denise said carefully, why we need to move quickly to resolve this. I understand why you need to. I'm still deciding whether I want to. Doug leaned forward. Claire, be reasonable. We're offering you your job back, a promotion, better compensation. You fired me 2 days after my husband left me, and I watched as every bit of the safety net I had was torn away from me. You fired me 2 days after my husband left me, and my voice stayed steady because I had promised myself I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me break. You smiled while security walked me out. You gave my account, the one I built for 11 years, to a 28-year-old who has never had an unscheduled conversation with Daniel Osei in his life. And now, 3 days later, when you discovered that firing me might cost you $25 million, you're suddenly interested in my value. The coffee shop was quiet enough that I heard Doug swallow. That's not, he started. That's exactly what happened, Preston said quietly, which surprised me. Preston, the company's own lawyer, siding with the truth over his employer's comfort. And for what it's worth, Claire, Walter Halbrook is deeply unhappy about how this was handled. This isn't just about the contract. It's about how this company treats people. I looked at Denise. Does Walter know everything about the timing, that this happened the same week as my divorce? Denise nodded slowly. Doug mentioned you seemed off that Monday. Walter asked him directly whether personal circumstances factored in the termination timeline. Doug said no. I looked at Doug. Is that true? Did personal circumstances factor in? Doug's silence answered more clearly than words could have. I think you saw an opportunity, I said, not as an accusation, just as a fact settling quietly into the space between us. I think you'd wanted Trevor on that account for months, because Trevor doesn't push back on you the way I did. And when you noticed I was distracted, upset, vulnerable, you saw your chance to make the change without resistance. That's not fair, Doug said, but his voice lacked conviction. Fair, I repeated softly. No, Doug, none of this has been fair, but it's about to become very public unless we find a way to make it right. I didn't demand my old job back. That surprised all of them, I think, sitting in that coffee shop with the afternoon light slanting through the windows, watching me consider terms none of them had anticipated. I want 3 things, I said. First, a written, board-acknowledged statement, not a press release, but something Daniel Osei and Vantage's legal team can review, confirming that my termination violated the personnel clause and that the decision has been formally reversed with accountability documented internally. Preston was already writing. Second, I want equity,
Not just a title. If Holbrook Meridian wants to keep the Vantage account, and if my relationship with that client is genuinely the asset holding this contract together, I want a direct stake in the account's performance. 2% of net revenue from Vantage Rail Freight, formalized in my new contract. Doug opened his mouth to object. Denise put a hand briefly on his arm, silencing him. Third, and this was the term that mattered to me most, though it had nothing to do with money, I want Doug removed from any decision-making authority over my role, my account, or my team. He can keep his title. I don't care about his title, but he does not manage me, evaluate me, or make personnel decisions that affect my position ever again. The silence after that lasted a long time. That's a significant restructuring, Denise said finally. So was firing me without cause the day after my husband left me. Walter Helbrook, it turned out, had been listening from a car parked outside the coffee shop the entire time. Denise had quietly called him during a bathroom break I hadn't noticed, and he'd driven over rather than wait for a summary. He walked in as I finished my third demand, and I watched Doug's face when his father-in-law appeared, because I understood immediately that whatever authority Doug believed he still held in that company was about to be tested in front of me.
"Miss Bennett," Walter said, extending his hand, "I owe you a personal apology, and I intend to give you every term you've requested." Doug stared at him. "Walter, we haven't even discussed—" "We're discussing it now," Walter said, not unkindly, but with a finality that silenced his son-in-law completely. "Claire, I founded this company on the principle that our people are our value, not our processes. My son-in-law forgot that this week in a way that nearly cost us everything. I won't forget it." I returned to Holbrook Meridian the following Monday, exactly 1 week after Marcus left, exactly 1 week after Doug's smile in that hallway, and I want to tell you that walking back through those doors felt like triumph, but honestly, it felt more like relief, quiet, steady relief. Trevor Ashford, to his credit, met me at my old office door with a box of my things still intact, untouched, sitting exactly where security had confiscated them. "I never wanted this account taken from you," he said. "I told Doug Wednesday, before any of this Vantage stuff blew up. I told him it felt wrong." I believed him. Trevor became, unexpectedly, one of my closest allies over the following months. Not a villain at all, just a young man caught in someone else's ambition. Daniel Osai called me personally that afternoon, his voice warm in a way I hadn't heard from him in the sharper, more formal tone he used in business settings.